Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have with me Clint Palermo. Clint, first of all, welcome to the pod.
Thanks so much, Tom. I'm happy to be here.
Clint, we're going to talk today about human trafficking, modern slavery, and a lot of other issues that are really significant to the business community. But before we get started, I wanted to ask you if you could tell our listeners or remind them about your professional background.
Absolutely. So I kind of like to think of myself as a regular guy in compliance. I started back in 2018 in Diligent. Back then we were known as Steel, and then that business unit became the due diligence business unit. I'm a senior manager now in due diligence, and I support the operations there. And I began in the field investigations group, actually doing due diligence for our clients. So I've seen all kinds of scenarios, all kinds of cases. My professional training is in law, public policy, and philosophy. So it makes a nice combo for combining perspectives there.
Clint, on the topic of human trafficking and modern slavery, what is the significance of that to the business community as you see it?
So it's vast, but I think we can start with what I find to be a really powerful and encouraging consensus emerging across jurisdictions right now. You have regulations all across jurisdictions that are addressing this specifically, targeting this issue specifically. You have Canada S211, right? And that deals with forced labor in supply chains. You have in the EU, you have sort of a multi-directive approach, but you have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CS3D. And I know that's sort of in flux right now with the omnibus and things are being delayed and changed, but it's still there. We also have the forced labor regulation, which, although it doesn't impose any new due diligence requirements, it does strictly ban items made with forced labor from the EU market. You got the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, a similar legislation in Australia. And then in the United States, probably the legislation that people are most aware of would be the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA. And that's really important, right? It's unique because of that rebuttable presumption, but it's part of a larger framework there, right? Items made with forced labor anywhere in the world coming to the United States can be stopped at the port of entry. So you've got regulations all over the place targeting this specific issue. And the specific requirements can be different across, and of course are across regulations, right? Whether there's specific due diligence duties, whether you have to report on your due diligence efforts, or whether you have to take active effort to prevent those negative impacts. So that's kind of the landscape we're looking at. And as an initial matter, of course, just failure to comply can result in enforcement action or denial of entry at a port. And those are obviously practical issues that we start with.
Clint, for me personally, the UK's legislation, the Modern Slavery Act, in many ways is not a starting point, but because of literally the title of the legislation, modern slavery, that word really resonates in the United States and across the world in a way that is visceral for many people. But
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned specifically the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and how is it companies get caught up in either of these pieces of legislation, perhaps without even knowing it?
We live in a global economy, complex supply chains, right? And you can be doing business in a place and not even know what all the inputs are, right? And if you're in that position, you have already uncertainty. You have a moral uncertainty and a practical uncertainty as well, right? We, of course, start with concerns about enforcement, but it's much, much bigger than that, right? You have pragmatic knock-on effects of operational disruption if you're caught in this quagmire of potential inputs that begin with forced labor, right? Then you have to pivot, right? You have that operational disruption. What do you do? Right? If critical inputs are suddenly stopped at the border and you don't have a substitute, where do you go from there? But then you also have the knock on into your reputation. And this is something that I think we can't emphasize enough because if you're doing business with third parties, whether you want it to or not, their reputation, their business practices are going to become part of your reputation, right? And if you don't know enough about those folks, if you don't really know who you're doing business with, their immoral business practice can become something that affects your larger reputation, even if you didn't want it to. even if you didn't direct them to do that. It just becomes part of your business footprint. And that is something that I think every business, every firm is going to want to make sure does not happen. I would even take it a step higher, right? It's, and I don't like to use philosophy terms that much in day-to-day life, but I think it really works here. It is a moral imperative, right? There's a moral imperative to stop these things from happening. And I think if a firm embraces that moral imperative, then they're going to pivot and construct a compliance system that is responsive to that moral imperative.
I'm really glad you phrased it that way because it really leads to another area of risk for every company, and that's reputational risk. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
there can be a fine. Yes, there can be a penalty. But frankly, I find the potential reputational risk even greater for several reasons. But the first of all is if a company gets ensnared in part of their supply chain has had forced labor or even paying very substandard wages, and that becomes a part of the public discourse, sales will be lost.
Mm-hmm.
Sales are not a bottom line loss, they're a top line loss.
Yeah.
And you may or may not get that customer back at some point, but you've
Mm-hmm.
lost that sale forever. And yes, they may buy later, but once again, you've lost that sale. And so, could you say a few words about the reputational risk and the discussions you would have with someone around that?
That's a really great point that you raise. And so you have that immediate effect, right? That immediate response from your clients, from your customers, when they find out something isn't right here, right? So you lose that sale. And maybe you lose a succession of sales, and that's never coming back. But then you have that reputational infusion, right? Something really horrible that another company did now becomes part of the conversation when people are talking about your company, right? And that doesn't go away. That fades slowly, so very slowly over time. And we can think about scandals in the garment industry, athletic apparel, sneakers and all that. And they just lingered and lingered because people find this abhorrent and rightfully. And when a company doesn't infuse that attitude, that moral imperative into what they do, they can get caught up in this due to insufficient controls, insufficient information. You really have to know who you're doing business with. So that reputation or whatever reputation you're partnering with is one that you want to have as part of your reputation. Because if you don't, you're going to be stuck with it for a long time. Sure, you have that initial economic, loss, but it's going to linger and you just don't want that. I would even extend it, if I could, briefly to a personal perspective on life. If that's okay. It doesn't.
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah. I kind of think we as people, we have to show up every day and decide who we are. We're walking down the street, you interact with a neighbor, you interact with someone when you're buying coffee, you interact with a colleague, you're engaged in all these roles in your life. You're a father, or I'm a father and husband, and all these different things. And we always try to bring our best and do our best. And every moment, every interaction, you're deciding who you are. You're deciding what your reputation will be, and you're deciding what behavior people are going to expect of you. And don't get me wrong, I would never, ever impose on anybody an expectation of perfection or flawlessness, but we try to get it right. We do our best to infuse that into our daily behavior. And I think the same is true of a firm. A firm decides in everything it does who it's going to be, what its reputation is going to be, and what behavior folks are going to expect of them. And I think that's a useful perspective to have. For me, it's a useful perspective to have. Hopefully, it's useful for other folks too.
Clint, we spent several minutes talking about what we both perceive as either the problem or at least some problems, but there's some solutions that you and your
Mm-hmm.
diligent colleagues have put
Mm-hmm.
together. I'm going to go back probably starting with Steel, but certainly at Diligent, because I know Steel obviously from a long time ago. What are some of the solutions that you can bring to bear?
I think it all starts with my favorite abbreviation, KY3P. Know your third party. You need to know the people you're doing business with. You need to know who is in your business neighborhood. And you do that through a coherent, defensible compliance program, but also being responsive to the risk. And of course, as taking a step back, you have to have a risk-based system to begin with, but responsive to the risks you're facing as a unique firm in a unique landscape. Where are you doing business? What kind of business are you doing? And then you, based on those initial risks, have to decide what level of information do I need about the individual third parties? How much do I need to know about each third party? And I think you need a really robust baseline of information that we in due diligence at Diligent, but in other mechanisms as well. You gather up, deciding what are we going to look at, how much are we going to look for, and based on those risks, what kind, how much of information do you need to know so that you can be confident, so you can feel powerful and prepared and have peace of mind in entering that business relationship. So you don't have those pragmatic issues of enforcement or goods stopped at the port of entry, or you don't have that reputational impact down the road, or you don't have that failing to embrace a moral imperative that I think we all should do. I think there's also an opportunity here for firms, and not just in gathering information to empower them and to help them make the right decisions, but to build a culture. And we talk about culture building in this industry all the time, right? But we kind of do it internally, right? We have an opportunity to build culture within a firm and throughout an industry. And it's a statement of we're going to do business in the right way. It's a commitment to stability and ethical business norms in an environment that can feel very unstable right now. So I think using that information as power to make your firm and the industry the firm and industry you want it to be. You have a chance to co-create this culture of ethical business norms. That's what I get excited about, really, when I think about this industry.
I've talked a lot about the requirements you need to have to be a chief compliance officer. I may add a philosophy minor to those requirements. That was as fine a discussion of the philosophy behind what we're trying to do on a business basis as I think I've ever heard. But let me turn to maybe some practical steps or even practical realities. I often say, in the government's eyes, if it's not documented, it never happened. So, how do you help a client go through the KY 3P? How do you help them document that? And how can that documentation be used literally on a go forward basis for either ongoing monitoring or a change if needed?
The pragmatic approach is you need to start with a system, a platform for managing your third parties. And you may have many third parties, right? This isn't a, 5 or 10 entities that you're dealing with. This could be hundreds, perhaps thousands. And for us, what we offer is a platform, the third party manager, to do exactly that, to take that vast number of third party entities and create some order around them to begin with, create a platform where you can access that information and create the profile for each of these individuals. And then based on a risk model in the manager, you can determine what level of due diligence, how deep you need to go, what sort of information you need to look for each individual entity. And then that's when the fun part comes in. That's where, my old work comes in. And of course, big shout out to the due diligence teams who are dealing with the devilish details day in and day out. But that's when we dig, right? That's when we dig. And we dig at a prescribed level that is based on that risk model, so that for every entity that you enter into the third party manager, every entity that's in your business neighborhood, and you're defining that business neighborhood, we go and we dig in at the appropriate level. And that might be an open source investigation. It might be an enhanced due diligence investigation followed by an additional due diligence investigation, or it might be a human rights investigation. It's really meant to be responsive to your risks as a firm and what you need to know. And that way, I would never go to a client and say, hey, get an ED across all third parties and all jurisdictions, no matter what. I don't want people to be doing things unless it is responsive to risk. So we have a whole spectrum, a whole menu of different due diligence options that look at target different information and also at different levels of depth and intensity. So that's kind of what we offer and how I think, if you're not doing it already, and I think many firms are, that's how we need to start thinking about it, so that you're ready with the information you need to address those risks and avoid those unfortunate consequences that we've talked about already.
Could we maybe end with your thoughts on why, even with robust DD and a platform, it's not a one and done? It's something that you have to do on a continuing basis.
Right.
What are your thoughts around that?
That's so important because things change over time, right? When you do some due diligence on a third party, you're gathering information up to that point. You're gathering a snapshot of information, and you need to check in over time. And the cadence is going to be different, also dependent on your risk, but it needs to be constantly updated on an appropriate cadence so that you're constantly aware, you're constantly prepared with the information you need to make sure that whatever seemed to be true about the third party at the onset is still true and is still true 2 years later and is still true 10 years later. It's an ongoing relationship, just like your business relationship is ongoing due diligence, so that you're not surprised, you're not caught, in a situation where you didn't have the right information to know who you were dealing with.
Clint, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely, Sam. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.